So I've got this old maple countertop, which I think you'll agree has seen better days. It used to be my kitchen island, but before that it must have been some sort of benchtop if the scarring on the underside is any indication. Even the good side's looking pretty rough. But despite all that, it's still a solid worktop, and with a little bit of effort I think I can give it a new lease on life. To start, I'll give it a good once-over on all sides with a 50 grit belt on the sander. At this point, I'm more concerned with taking out the worst of the gouges than I am making it dead flat and smooth. And if you're wondering, a lot of my power tools are nearly as old as I am, so the dust bag on this old beast is just for show. Maybe I should take a look at that someday. Anyway, now's a good time to deal with all the holes. Most of these go all the way through, but as I only need to fix up one side, I figure some plugs are the way to go. I've got a set of plug cutters, so I'll bore out a variety of different ones in a piece of scrap. Using a screwdriver to pop them out is a great way to play hide and seek with yourself in the shop, by the way. Might never find that one. I want to use a Forstner bit to make a nice clean hole, but with nothing for the spur to dig into, it would wander all over the place. So I made a little guide to both position the bit and to keep it steady. It does a good job of keeping the bit from wandering, and once it's started, I can finish it off without it. Filling the holes is nothing special, just some regular carpenter's glue and my big hammer. Anyway, I tried to line up the grain on these, but otherwise I just banged them in. Honestly, I own like 20 hammers. Why did I grab this one? This big knot hole needs more than just a plug, so I'll have to try something else. I could have done just a square patch, but I decided to do more of a Dutchman shape as a nod to that technique. It doesn't have any structural advantage here, I just like the look of it. I'm using a scrap of cherry for the patch. It doesn't have a lot of contrast right now, but over time the cherry should get darker and help it stand out a little bit more. I don't have to be super precise in cutting the Dutchman itself, but once it's done I carefully scribe around it. Oh, and I'll put a registration mark on there as well to help keep things lined up. To hog out most of the waste I'll use a straight router bit, and then I'll finish it up by hand with chisels. That looks like a good fit, so I'll get that glued in. I found a bigger hammer for this one, but I did use a piece of scrap to protect the patch as I banged it in. A flush cut saw does a decent job of trimming down those plugs. Not perfect, but I still need to do some more work on the surface finish, so it'll do for now. The Dutchman, on the other hand, would be a pain to trim with that little saw, so I'll bring it down first with a smooth plane and then finish it up with a block plane. There was one other hole that was a bit too big for a plug, so I cut a little diamond-shaped patch out of cherry and put that in the same way that I did the others. It's too soon to think of top coating this piece right now, but I need to get started on the finish anyway. I really like using shellac for my wood projects. I learned that from watching the furniture guys on PBS back in the day. Remember those guys? Joe and Ed? Love those guys. Shellac in its flake form will last basically forever on the shelf, so I measure out just what I need and I dissolve it in alcohol. I'm mixing about a 1 pound cut, which is a pretty thin consistency. I like to use it like this because it dries pretty quickly, and that means I can do multiple coats in a pretty short time. With that mixed up, I'll just put it aside for a few days while I get on with the build. This block that fell out is actually too loose to just glue back in, so I'll make a new piece from another chunk of butcher block. I'll do that on the table saw with the sled. I've got a finishing blade in there, so it leaves a good finish for gluing, and the sled's a great way for working on small parts. The tail vise on my bench makes for a perfect clamp to keep that in place too. I decided I'm going to make a proper base for this bench, and for that I'm going to pull out this load of 8/4 maple that I've been holding on to. My dad and I milled this up over 20 years ago, so I figure it's seasoned enough and it's high time I did something with it. I'm going to start by breaking down the boards to rough size, which will make them easier to handle for jointing and planing. With some of the boards I had to work around some defects, and so for those I used a rip blade and the table saw to break them down lengthwise first. I'll need 8 short pieces that'll get glued up for the top and bottom pieces of the trestle ends, and 4 longer pieces for the legs. I'll start dressing the rough boards on the jointer. I'm just showing you doing one here so that the video isn't 8 hours long, but you get the idea. A couple of passes on one face gets that flat enough for me to square up a corner. With 2 faces jointed, I brought those pieces over to the planer where I'll bring them down close to the final thickness. My design calls for 4 pieces that are 2.5 inches thick, but since my stock is only 8/4, I'll need to glue up some boards to get that final thickness. The first set gets clamped up while I glue up the next ones, and then I'll add those into the clamps as I go. The next day those are dry, so I can now dress them down to their finished dimensions. Here I'm keeping the workpiece flush to the jointer's back fence, which will get rid of the glue and give me a square corner at the same time. Then with that square corner against the table saw fence, I can rip the workpiece so that all the corners are square and the faces are parallel. Then I can go back to the planer to dress everything to its final width and thickness, and then I'll finish up on the table saw to cut it to length. I didn't have quite enough capacity on the table saw to cut these in one pass, so I set up a stop block and used a spacer that allowed me to accurately reposition the workpiece flush with the side of the blade. It wasn't as nice a finish as a single pass would have been, but for a project like this I was more than happy with it. With one end squared off, I could then use a stop block on the fence to register the pieces for both passes. So that's the top and bottom rails for the trestle ends done. The thicker ones are the feet, and the 2 other ones will be at the top. The 4 leg pieces are longer but not as thick, so dressing these to size is a bit more straightforward. So in short order, I've got all 8 of those main pieces done, and it's time to start on the joinery. I'm going to lay out some beefy 1-inch thick tenons on the 4 leg pieces. I always like to mark out my joinery first, so I've got a clear idea what I'm doing, and I'll always mark the waist area as well. There's nothing worse than cutting on the wrong side of the line. Again, I'm using a stop block on the table saw sled to make repeatable cuts. You can't see it here, but the stop block has a screw in it that I register the workpiece against. If I need to, I can turn the screw to make micro adjustments, and the sawdust won't get packed in up against it, which would throw things off too. To save time, I made the shoulders the same depth as the cheek cuts, so I could make all 4 passes without changing the setup. I've had this cast iron tenoning jig for ages, and I don't get to use it very often, but this is exactly what it was made for. Too bad the offcut is thinner than my table saw insert. Can't have that now, can we? A quick change up and then I'm good to go. With the jig reset, I can then cut the shoulders on the two front legs, but for the back ones, I offset the tenons a bit, so for those I'll use the table saw to cut the shoulders. With all the tenons cut, I'll get to work on the mortises. I'll lay those out with a marking gauge and then darken the lines with a pencil. I also mark the center lines, which will help me line everything up when I drill out the waist in a moment. I went with 1-inch mortises and tenons so that I could use my 1-inch Forstner bit to hog out most of the waist. I don't have a mortising machine, so this is the next best thing. I've chopped mortises in maple completely by hand before, so this is a lot faster. I will use chisels to clean everything up though. I'm not opposed to power tools, as you can tell. They definitely have their place in the shop, but I really do enjoy the pace of doing handwork. That being said, when your mortises are just a tad too narrow, it's a fine thing to be able to give those tenons a little haircut on the table saw. Even so, I still do the final adjustments by hand. At this stage, I can do a dry fit to make sure that everything fits, and while they're assembled, I'll lay out the joinery for the mid-braces. These are probably overkill as far as strength goes, but if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing, right? These will get the same mortise and tenon treatment, just on a slightly smaller scale. Here you can see the adjustment screw on my stop block, and again, I laid out my cuts so that I can use the same setup to trim the shoulders. When I can, I like to lay out my joinery while the pieces dry fit together. It's cheap insurance to make sure that I don't drill a mortise on the wrong side of the leg, for example. No, I'm not foreshadowing, I actually mean that. And here I'm laying out the large notches for the two stretchers that'll connect the end assemblies together later. With everything marked up, I can knock everything apart and get back to making sawdust. There's any number of ways I could have cut these notches, but because there were only 4 of them, I decided to just nibble away the waste on the table saw. After that, it was no trouble to knock out the rest of the wood with a hammer, which, if I'm honest, is pretty satisfying. After that, I'll clean up the notch first with a router plane and then a shoulder plane. I don't need to make a perfectly smooth face here, as these joints are meant to be disassembled and so they won't ever have any glue. Here I'm cutting one of the stretchers to length. I didn't show much of the process for these as they're just 1-inch boards, but you'll see more of them a little bit later. The narrower mortises do tend to get clogged up with chips when gang drilled, but otherwise, cleaning them up is no different than the larger ones I did earlier. At this stage, I'll do another dry fit just to make sure everything is as it should be. Everything's looking good, so now I'll take a bit of time to dress things up a little bit. I want to do sort of a classic rounded foot profile, so I first lay out a small shoulder and then grab a handy spray can to mark the radius. The top of each foot will be less visible, so those will just get finished off with a simple 45-degree cut. That's easy enough to do on the table saw using my bevel cutting sled, but the roundovers take a little bit more work. Even so, I can still get rid of most of the waste with a couple of passes on the saw. That's got me close to the final shape, and I'll just finish the roundover with my low-angle block plane. And then I'll give it all a final smoothing on the sander. I always like to give my sharp edges a slight chamfer, and the block plane's ideal for that. Except on the curves, where I'll just freehand that with a chisel. For a final surface finish, I like to use a card scraper rather than sandpaper. A sharp scraper is a pleasure to use, and I think it leaves a superior finish to sandpaper. They only take a minute or two to sharpen, and when properly tuned, a scraper will produce shavings rather than dust, even on this hard maple. Alright Dennis, they get it. That's enough B-roll of the scraper. So that's the lion's share of the joinery all done, and all the cuts are in the right places, so I'm pretty happy. The last thing I'll do before moving on to the assembly and finishing will be to put my mark on it. I started doing this years ago, and I really like looking back on the things that I've made and seeing the date that I made it, so I'm going to do it here too. These stamps don't take much effort to use, but they can be a little bit tricky to line up. I messed up the R, but it'll still do the trick. Cleaning up glue squeeze out is one of my least favorite things, so here I'm putting everything back together again so I can apply a coat of shellac before the glue up. The idea is that the excess glue won't stick to the shellac, and I'll have an easier time cleaning it off. I'll try not to use too much glue, but some squeeze out is inevitable, so this is a good precaution. I've tried taping all the joints in the past, but that's a pain, and I always seem to get some tape stuck in the joints, so I prefer this method. As you can see, my shellac is all dissolved now. If this were a piece of fine furniture, I'd probably filter this at this stage, but as it's just a bench, I'm okay with it as it is. Using a bristle brush, I apply it sparingly, trying to avoid runs and always working on a wet edge. Even though this is a very thin mixture, you will see brush strokes if you let them dry without feathering them out. At this time of year, my shop is usually about 45% humidity and maybe 15 degrees Celsius, but even at that fairly low temperature, this will be dry in about an hour or two. Just to be on the safe side though, I gave it until the next day before coming back for one final disassembly. You can see that the shellac didn't penetrate much at all into the joints, so it won't interfere with the actual strength of the glued joint. I start by gluing in the middle stretcher first, as there'd be no way to get it in place otherwise. I'll put some clamps on that sub-assembly while I put the glue on the top mortises and tenons. Those take a bit of persuasion to get into place, so I'll put some clamps on those too while I glue up the bottom. The glue will grab in the first couple of minutes, so I want to make sure that these joints are tight right away. With the mortises and the foot glued up, I'll just pop off the clamps, get the tenons glued as well, and then I'll get the whole assembly clamped up to dry. I gave those a couple of hours to really set before getting them out of the clamps. Now I can see how my shellac trick worked on the squeeze out. Not too bad. The glue's still a bit soft, and it might actually have been better if I'd let it dry fully, and it would chip away a little bit easier. Even so, I didn't have too much, and getting it cleaned up wasn't a problem. As I said, I want to be able to disassemble this bench if necessary, so I'm going to pilot drill the stretchers and legs for some heavy screws. With the stretchers laid in their notches, I'll get them squared up and then fix them in place with some cabinet maker's clamps. That way I can drill the screw holes without things shifting out of square. I drilled 2 holes in each position before switching out to a wider bit to enlarge the holes in the stretchers. Doing that will let the screws pass right through, and that'll pull the joint tight. The holes in the legs are made with a smaller bit just to give them the proper depth. I'll get those installed with some screws to hold everything in place, and then I'll go back to add a 3rd hole to each position. With the base fully assembled but turned upside down, I need to lay out how it's going to get attached to the bench top. I get everything centered and squared up, and then I'll clamp it firmly in place. The connection between the top and the base is just going to be done with 2 wooden pegs. To make sure that they line up, I carefully mark the underside of the bench top and the side of the leg assemblies. I then measure into what will be the center of the leg and mark that spot with an awl. I can then drill a 1-inch hole, which will accept the peg. This attachment method relies on the weight of the top to keep it in place, and it's exactly how my cabinet maker's bench that I'm doing all this on is built. It's simple and effective, and I've never had my bench top jump off the base, so I'm going to say it works. The top of the legs get a corresponding mark, and I sure hope I measured properly, otherwise it's not going to fit. I don't drill the holes in the legs as deeply, as those need only accept and glued-in pegs. As for the pegs, I just cut them to length before rounding off the top edges and gluing them into place. Oh, and here you can see what the properly dried glue does on the shellac. It flakes right off. Speaking of shellac, I can now put on a couple of final coats. I take my time as before, making sure I get a nice even coat without any runs. And with the stretchers done now, I can give those a coating of shellac as well. When that's dry, I'm going to come back and give it a light sanding with some 220 grit paper, just to knock down any dust, bubbles, or any raised grain. I wipe up any dust with a tack cloth, and then I'll put on another coat. Up until now, I've been using the bench top itself as a work surface, but with the base done, it's time to get back to refinishing it. On the underside, I'm not going to do any more sanding, so I'll just give it a single coat of shellac to seal it. When that's dry, I'll give it a flip and move on to cleaning up the top surface. First, I need to level off that patched in piece with the plane. This end of the bench is pretty rough as well, so I'll lay out a line to trim it off. It's too big and heavy to go on the table saw, so instead I'll set up a straight edge and I'll trim it with a circular saw. With that done, I'll switch out the belt sander for a medium grit belt and give the whole thing a good sanding. And finally, I'll break out the card scraper again and go over the entire surface. This will remove all the fine scratches from the belt sander, and if there's a spot that needs a little bit of extra help, I can give that a few extra scrapes. It's a bit hard on the hands, but a sharp scraper makes it a lot easier, and I was surprised at how soon I was done. I'll give it a bit of a vacuum to get the last of the dust, and then it's on to shellac. I could have found myself a bigger brush, I guess, but this is the one that I had been using, so it wasn't too much of a hardship. When the first coat was dry, I was pretty happy with the surface finish, so I went right to a second coat. And when that was dry, the build's all done. All I need to do now is get it installed. I made this bench specifically for my bookbinding studio, and I think it'll be a big asset here, both in looks and functionality. If you've come here for my bookbinding channel, then I'm glad you're here. I hope you enjoyed the video no matter how you found me, and if you did, it would be great if you could subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. I'll be back with more 4Keys Workshop content soon, I'm sure, so I'd love for you to join me. Anyway, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll see you later.